That was certainly some beautiful singing to start off with tonight. I really enjoyed that song, "Shall We Gather at the River." That's right up my alley, the kind of hymn I like. But the truth is, it's also good to get out of our comfort zone sometimes and learn these new songs that a lot of them I just haven't learned yet. So
yeah, I changed the lyrics to that song one time, and forever thereafterwards, I will remember Jerry calling me the Weird Al of gospel.
Yeah,
I'll laugh till I cry.
there's a lot of songs that lend themselves to different occasions, and sometimes whenever they're singing these new ones, I think they sound good, but the thing is, I don't know them a lot of times. So sometimes I'm mouthing the words, but I'm not really singing. It's not because I'm not into it. It's just I don't really know the song that well. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
She said she don't even find the key till the last verse.
Oh yeah, see, that's another thing about reading music. I can't necessarily read it to the degree that I should, but I can tell when we're singing. I can see the notes go up and down. I can hear and see that. So that's a start. If you can do that, and it's interesting to try to do that and learn different words. I wanted to learn tenor so bad, and through the years, and I finally done it. And people who's helped me, they say you just got to do it. If you try to halfway do it, it's not going to come out right. So
there's something I tried. I couldn't get that high. I got up on my tippy toes. Maybe if there's a big old grizzly bear following me, I could get that high.
yeah.
But no, I just back off. No, can't do it.
Of course, there's bass. I mean, I like to practice bass sometimes and different parts of music there. But I appreciate everybody being out for Bible study tonight. Before we get into the study, I just wanted to make an announcement about Sunday mornings, my sermons. I've been preaching on 1 Peter chapter 1, and you've noticed I've done about 3 or 4 going through there. My plan was, and I diverted from that last week because I've been so swamped in my ministry, to be honest, in the work I'm doing. So I didn't have time to do a sermon outline on Peter. But I'm not going to leave that hanging. My plan was to go through every chapter like that, but I think that's going to take too long, and I don't want to neglect the rest of the Bible to study and preach from 1 Peter. So what I'm going to do over the next few weeks, I'm just going to take the theme from the rest of each chapter, which there's only 4 chapters left, and I'm going to do a sermon on each one. So we're not done with 1 Peter yet. If you're just wondering why, I meant to mention that last week, but I forgot to. But that's what I plan on doing with that. So just be prepared for that, and it may not be consecutive weeks. It may kind of be spread out, but I will get to 2nd chapter, 3rd chapter, 4th, and 5th of 1 Peter. It's a good book, and like I said, I do want to finish that up. So
Take your time. You've got a lifetime ahead of you.
right. I mean, the thing about it is, I just don't. I know that sometimes I'm trying to have my finger on the pulse of what you guys are interested in, and I know that I get bored sometimes with the same subject sometimes. So, but anyways, we're continuing in the book of Numbers tonight, and we've been studying through here. We're getting close to the end of the book, and we've seen that the book of Numbers, it's the pilgrimage of faith. It is a good example, illustration of what we're doing in our Christian life. When we're walking every day in our Christian life, it's not just one big step that we do. It's something that we continuously learn. And Jesus, he makes this point whenever he says in Matthew 28 to go therefore and teach all nations and baptize them. Well, he shows the importance there. You're going to have to let people understand what they're doing. They're going to have to understand that they're in transgression. They're going to have to understand why they even need the gospel. And that takes teaching. That takes taking time with people to make sure that they can understand with their mind for themselves why they're doing what they're doing. But then he says after that, teaching them to observe all things I've commanded you. And so after baptism, we don't just sit down on the pew and sit on the bench. We still got work to do. We still got learning to do. And it's a lifelong journey, if you will, which is what the Israelites are doing. And of course, Peter says in 2 Peter 3, verse 18, I believe, or actually I think it's 1 Peter 3, 15. He says, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you. No, that's not the verse I'm looking for. It's 2 Peter 3, 18. He says to grow in grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So he makes the point there, we're continuously we're moving towards something every day in our Christianity. It's not like, well, okay, I finally got this thing licked. Now I can chill out and just kind of, you know, that, right? You have to continue to go on, and that's what they're doing in the book of Numbers. Is we see them going through the wilderness. We see them walking with God, and God's trying to help them understand what it's all about and why they're even different from other nations. What is it going to make you different, and why you're walking with God, and how to train them to live with God and make them fit to go into the land of Canaan. Now, of course, we know that the land of Canaan is symbolic of what? Heaven. I don't know who said that, but they got the right answer. Good job. So heaven is the right answer, and the gospel is designed to make us fit to go to heaven whenever we die. And so we see here that we've seen some good things that they've done, but we've also seen where they have complained and murmured against God. They've complained with Moses. They've put him to the test. They put his feet over the fire time and time again. And there's a reason it says that he's the meekest man upon the face of the earth. It's because every time they did this, even when they were doing it directly to him and saying, you're making yourself a leader out here, we want a part of that. Whenever Korah and his company did that, that was an insult to Moses personally and to God. But that was directed at Moses, and Moses was meek enough to go to the Lord and try to pray for them every time it happened, to make sure that he didn't want to see them get punished and wiped off the face of the earth. And so we see there that it's been a rocky road. I mean, you could say that about the book of Numbers. It's been a rocky road up to where we are now. We're with an entirely different generation here. One generation has passed off the scene due to their disobedience and due to the fact that they have transgressed God's commandments, and God said, you're not going into the land until every single one of that generation passes off the scene. And now that's where we are here in the book of Numbers. They're in the plains of Moab here. We're with an entirely new generation. We're starting with a clean slate here. And so we see here that in this particular place that we're at, they're getting ready. They're about to go into the land of Canaan very shortly, as far as time is concerned. So, are there any questions or comments up to where we are now? All right. So we started out where we got to chapter 28 last week, and we talked about a couple of things. Verse 2, the phrase "a sweet savor," and we looked at some verses from the New Testament there about how that some of the New Testament writers will allude to that when it talks about our works of faith and our prayers ascending up to God as a sweet-smelling savor. Now that's what he's talking about in the New Testament when you read about that. He's alluding back to these sacrifices. And now I want to make it clear, the prayers in Revelation that I alluded to, that I went to last week, that is actually a reference to the altar of incense, but it's the same concept. There's a reason I went to it. It's talking about the smell of the incense, creating a pleasant aroma. And the same way that worked, the sacrifices apparently created an aroma that was pleasant to be around, and God uses that as a way to compare our works of faith that we do today, our obedience. Before we get moving too far along, I want to put something on the board for us here, back to the old drawing board. And we're going to be looking at some chapter 28 and 29 is basically reiterating some laws that they've been over further. And I'll be honest, it doesn't really seem to make sense to me why we have a break right here and that they go over this, but God has a reason for it, and I'm sure that there's a good one. But does anybody remember the three main feast days that all the males had to be in Jerusalem at least once in a year?
Passover.
Okay. Got Passover. Anybody remember the other ones?
Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacles.
There you go. You got it. So it's Passover, Pentecost, which is the Feast of Weeks. And, see, you said Tabernacles, right?
Yeah.
It can be, it's Tabernacles, I call it the Feast of Booths, but
Yeah.
Tabernacles is the technical term.
Yeah.
So we'll just put Tabernacles on there. So just remember, these three feasts are very important as far as the system of Judaism. All the males had to be at Jerusalem for these three feasts once in the year. Nobody was exempt from these. Now, all the feasts were not like that. There were other feasts like first fruits and different things like that, blowing of trumpets and things like that. Those were not as important as these three feasts. Does anybody remember what Passover was about? Right, he's basically just commemorating whenever they came out of Egypt, and the Lord, where he saw the blood on the doorpost, he would pass over, and the death of the firstborn would not occur there. And Pentecost actually had to do with their crops, with God blessing them and their crops and things like that, because their lives was very agricultural.
Wasn't Pentecost like 50 days after the Passover?
Every time.
Yeah, Penta means 50, doesn't it?
Yeah, Penta means 50, and y'all both bring up a good point. Pentecost, some holidays, like for example the 4th of July, it may fall on a different day of the week every year, right? Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, it could change every year. Pentecost was never like that. Pentecost was always count 7 Sabbaths and the day following, which was what?
50.
Sunday. It was Sunday. Yeah, it was 50, but the day that it landed on was Sunday, the first day of the week, every time. It never landed on a different day. Now, other things that they observed back there may fall on a different day, but Pentecost was always on the first day of the week, which is proof that the church began on the first day of the week, because it said in Acts chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost was fully come, so on and so on. So that's an important feast. And then we have Tabernacles, which has to do with commemorating their wilderness wanderings in the 40 years, how God took care of them, and they would dwell in booths or tents, if you will. And they were out there as a nation out in the wilderness. And God was providentially, His providence, He was taking care of them, and He did it, and they were dwelling in tents the whole time. So I just want you to remember these. These are very important here. So is everybody good on this? All right. One other thing before we get going in the book here, in the chapters. The Jewish people had two different calendars. Okay? They had, let me put this up here. They had what they call a civil and a religious. So their religious calendar. Let me put the civil calendar. It began in the month what they would call Tishri, which equals our September, October. And then their religious calendar began in Nisan, which equals our March and April. Is everybody, I know this is maybe a little bit complex, but is everybody with me on this? Okay, let me, I'm going to show you a little better what I'm talking about. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 12 briefly.
We still do the same thing in our time.
I'm going to show you something. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 12. So in Exodus chapter 12, just to bring you up to speed, they're getting ready to go out of Egypt. The Lord is getting ready to teach them about the Passover. In Exodus chapter 12, it says, "And the Lord spake to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year. Okay, so at this time, he's saying your calendar, since you're a unique nation, you're not going to have a calendar like everybody else around you. All the other nations in the calendar you've been on, the civil calendar, you're not going to be on that no more as far as your religious aspect. Okay? So when everybody else was on a different calendar here, they would be on they would be on a different timetable, if that makes sense.
The religious calendar.
Right, but they still used the civil calendar. They still used it for certain things. And look at Numbers chapter 29 in the book that we're studying. This is the whole reason that I brought this up, because it was chapter 29 here. Chapter 29 of Numbers, it says, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work. It is a day of blowing of trumpets. So when it says the 7th month here, that is the 7th month of their religious calendar. Now the civil, as far as the civil calendar, they were on a different month there. So he's talking about the religious calendar here.
So how do we know that these months for them equals out to September and October for us and March and April?
Because whenever you go through and look at their feasts and different things that they were commemorating and their harvest and stuff, you can see what time of year it was. You can see, like, when they would get ready to harvest, you do it in warmer weather. And so people have gone through and they've been able to see what time of year that was when they were in a certain month, if that makes sense. Because, for example, if it talks about a certain date on our calendar and you see obviously that it's time for the crops to come in, we know what that is on our calendar. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is cross references and stuff like that for where, because all you have to do is click back for a certain number. The modern calendar we use is the Gregorian calendar. The one that the Romans used was the Julian calendar, and they're pretty close to each other. And I don't know where the Julian calendar is in relation to what the Hebrews would have used for a civil calendar.
So, right. So you're getting to the point. I'm saying other nations around them, they would be on the civil calendar too. Yeah. It's like that's what they were on. But God said, whenever you get over, when you start worshiping me, we're gonna switch this up. You're gonna be on a different calendar as far as your religious service. So in there,
the Jews still use that same calendar.
Yeah, they still use this. And when it says here in Numbers 29, verse 1, that it was the 7th month, that was their religious calendar. So in the 7th month, that would equal the first month of the civil year. Okay?
I was just grunting.
So
yeah, we use similar stuff today in business. Anybody here that's been in business knows the difference between a calendar year and a fiscal year.
Yeah.
Which right now starts in April because that's when tax season is. So fiscal years for companies start in April. Well, it depends. Some of them are good.
Starts in May because it's based on when the company was originally founded.
Okay.
It's not has nothing to do with taxes.
I don't want you to get too bogged down. I don't want everybody to get too bogged down with this. All you need to know is the religious calendar was more important. The one that you're mainly going to be really needing to know about is the religious one in the Bible. So, but just remember that there was another calendar that they would, the other nations, and they were looking at that they would use it, but it was secondary. If that makes sense.
So their religious calendar started around March and April.
Yes.
And their month.
Wait a minute. The religious calendar started.
Yeah, that's what you got right up here. March, April, we're on Nisan.
Yeah. So the religious one would start in March and April.
The days of the month were the same, an equal amount of days per month.
Yeah. As far as the numbers and the months and stuff like that, I would say it'd be the same. But what my point is, the religious calendar, it would start. It would begin when it began, the civil calendar was not beginning. It was on a different day, but it was the same day, if that makes sense. I hope I'm not getting everybody bogged down too much here.
And a lot of their months revolve around the lunar cycle. So it was from full moon to full moon rather than a certain number of days.
And you know, the basic they were more they used their calendar. It was very important to them because of their crops and agriculture. They had the moon cycles and everything like you mentioned. They really, that was a big part of their life. We don't really care much. We don't care if it's full moon or half moon or anything. We just know that, you know, Monday rolls around. Yeah, we got the Farmer's Almanac and stuff, but we basically care about, you know, it's Monday again. So it's time to go to work, and we got hump day, which is Wednesday, and all that. You know, they were looking at moon cycles and their crops and God's blessings through their calendar. So it was more important probably to them than it would be to us.
Yeah, they were. It's time to plant. It's time to harvest. It's time to.
Yeah, and God, He all these feasts and everything we're studying, Passover, Pentecost, and Booths, that's all according to their calendar. You know, they would be going to their calendar for those things. So in chapter 28, one thing we notice here is he starts out with a daily offering, and then he goes with a weekly offering, and then a monthly offering, and a yearly. So in verses 1 through 8, we have this daily offering, and we mentioned last week the priests, they had their work cut out for them. If people weren't bringing sacrifices for sins or trespass or sin offerings or anything, or voluntary offerings, they were offering a daily morning and evening sacrifice, whether anything else came or not. And we read those verses last week. Then we see in verses 9 and 10, we had a weekly offering, which was on the Sabbath. So chapter 28, verse 9, it says, on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, of 2 tenth deals of flour for a meat offering, mingled with oil, and the drink offering thereof. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath, beside the continual burnt offering and his drink offering. And so we see here the Sabbath was a big deal. That was a very important part of their religious service. It was every seventh day of the week. And on the Sabbath day, they couldn't do any servile work. They were to, the whole purpose of the Sabbath day, they were to stop their business transactions and stop their manual labor and meditate upon God and put faith in God that I don't have to work every day. I'm not in this world I'm actually a stranger and a pilgrim in this world. I'm not here to pile up material things on the earth and live by those. And so on the Sabbath day, they were to sit back and not do any work and trust that God would take care of them. And the fact that, and regardless if they worked every day or not. So the Sabbath was a big deal for them. Matter of fact, let's turn back to Exodus 20 and look what it says about the Sabbath day. In Exodus chapter 20, we see here Moses is at Mount Sinai, and the nation is at Mount Sinai, and God comes down on the mount. He's trying to get them acquainted with himself and so on. And we see in chapter 20, he gives these 10 commandments. And if you'll notice, in every one of these commandments, the only one that gives extensive principles and things is the Sabbath. All the other ones are pretty brief, if you'll notice that. So in the Sabbath, it says in verse 8, he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the 7th is the Sabbath day of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is. And he rested the 7th day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now we see here that he makes the point. God actually created the earth in the beginning in the book of Genesis. We see that he did that by speaking this creation into existence, and he did that in 6 days. And then the 7th day it said that God rested. Now, that doesn't mean that God gets tired as we do. That just simply means he looked at his creation and he was able to take a day and not do any more as far as the creation is concerned. And one of the main points that we see here is the fact that behind the physical creation is the spiritual. That's what God was wanting them to see about the Sabbath command and the Sabbath day. And like I said, he says right here, just remember, when you're resting on the Sabbath day, the Lord created the earth in 6 days and he rested on the seventh. And he's wanting to take their mind back to the fact that behind everything we see in this physical world, and we see decay written all over everything in this world, that God is behind that. He's the one created it. The spiritual is behind that. So, the Sabbath was a very important day for the Jewish religion. So that was the weekly, and then in verse 11 we see the monthly offering, and this would be the let's see here, the beginning of your months. I'll just read the verses. It says in verse 11, "And in the beginning of your months you shall offer a burnt offering unto the Lord, 2 young bullocks and 1 ram, 7 lambs of the first year without spot, and 3/10 deals for a meat offering mingled with oil for 1 bullock, and 2/10 deals of flour for a meat offering mingled with oil for 1 ram. And a several 10th deal of flour mingled with oil for a meat offering unto 1 lamb, for a burnt offering of a sweet savour, a sacrifice made by fire unto the Lord. And their drink offering shall be half an hin of wine unto a bullock, and the 3rd part of an hin unto a ram, and the 4th part of an hin unto a lamb. This is the burnt offering of every month throughout the months of the year. And 1 kid of the goats for a sin offering unto the Lord shall be offered beside the continual burnt offering and his drink offering." So do you see the progress that we're doing here? We've got a daily offering, we've got a weekly offering, and now we've got a monthly offering. So God is a God of order, right? He does things in an organized way. He does things that is in an orderly way there. So we've seen the daily offering, the weekly offering, the monthly offering. And then in verse 16 we see where he makes reference to the Passover. It says, "In the 14th day of the first month is the Passover of the Lord, and in the 15th day is a month is a feast. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten," and so on. So basically we see here it's going from a daily, a weekly, a monthly. And the Passover is something they did yearly. They had to do this every year. So even whenever they came out of Egypt, the thing about killing the lamb and putting the blood on the doorpost, there were certain regulations with that wouldn't follow after that, of course. It'd be a little different, if that makes sense. Because they would be out of Egypt, there were certain things they wouldn't need to do, if that makes sense. But one thing that was peculiar to it was they would kill a lamb, and they would have a feast, and Passover was a big deal. That was the one event that was it showed God's care and concern for them. It showed that God was not going to get them out in the wilderness and leave them in the lurch. I mean, if he could get them out of the most powerful nation on the earth at that time with no problem, would he get them out in the wilderness and leave them in the lurch? Of course not. But they, sometimes they got that idea and they would start losing their faith. So we see that. Then we see in verse 26 is another yearly feast, which is called Pentecost. Verse 26 says, "Also in the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new meat offering unto the Lord, after your weeks be out, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work. But ye shall offer the burnt offering for a sweet savour unto the Lord, 2 young bullocks, 1 ram, 7 lambs of the first year, and their meat offering of flour mingled with oil, 3/10 deals unto 1 bullock, 2/10 deals unto 1 ram, a several 10th deal unto 1 lamb throughout the 7 lambs, and the 1 kid of the goats to make an atonement for you. You shall offer them beside the continual burnt offering and his meat offering. They shall be unto you without blemish, and their drink offerings." So this is what they would do on the Feast of Pentecost. And as I said, on Pentecost they were commemorating and they were focusing on the fact that God was blessing them in their crops. That every year they would plant crops and they'd be blessed as long as they were obedient, of course. So that pretty much wraps up chapter 28. We got a daily, a weekly, a monthly, and a yearly offering here. Any questions or comments on this one?
God kept his people busy. He kept working, he kept them busy. And it just seems to me like that the old adage, idle hands is the devil's workshop. I think it applies back then. And I thought we see the fruits of it today. We have too much time. We are not busy ourselves with what we should be doing, and that's what gets us into trouble.
It's certainly what you're saying there makes sense. It's hard to imagine, somebody being idle.
They were constantly, this constantly.
Yeah, of course. And we got to remember also that it wasn't like they were being.
It wasn't just busy work.
Well, yeah, I mean, and also what I'm trying to say is it wasn't like they were being. It was not like just continual. They weren't wearying themselves, if you will. They were. A lot of these feasts were meant to have them to recharge and to celebrate and to take time to. Recharge, whatever, reboot, however you want to put it. And so it was not like they were working every second of every day and just being torn down by work. They did work, but there were times where God wanted them to pause and just focus upon and meditate upon what God has done for them and celebrate and enjoy and get pleasure in that. But the problem was, the Sabbath day was meant for that. For example, they were to rest and get relaxation and rest on the Sabbath day. They weren't supposed to be a workaholic, if you will. They weren't supposed to work themselves to death. God doesn't want His children to do that. But work is honorable. I don't want you to misunderstand me. But He doesn't want people. He doesn't want His people just living for work and living for material things. So the Sabbath day, they were to stop and pause and relax and recharge and focus upon God and use that to do that. But instead, as time went on, they got so focused on material things and money, they couldn't even rest on the Sabbath day. They had, they wanted to be making money all the time, and they abused the Sabbath day. And they were selling and buying on the Sabbath day and doing things they shouldn't have been doing. And if you'll notice, we're running out of time here, but on the Sabbath day, the very time that the nation of Israel started abusing the Sabbath day, that was the very first indication that they were fixing to go off into apostasy. They were about to get off the track and go off of God's program. So the Sabbath day was a huge deal, and they were supposed to really respect the Sabbath day, but they didn't as time went on. So I guess this is a good place for us to stop this evening. I appreciate you being here for Bible study. And although we didn't get into chapter 29, I purposely had this class titled as Numbers 28 and 29 on the Facebook because I asked Arlene to do that because this is a section. These two chapters go together. So we're going to continue right here. We'll pick up in chapter 29 next week. I appreciate your attention tonight. At this point, we'll get into our invitation portion for tonight. Tonight, I want to look at the account of a man named Elisha. And I want to show how in the Old Testament, this prophet, he actually has an encounter here with a woman who was she was in debt. She owed money to people, to the creditors, if you will. She had some bills that were overdue, and she was about to be thrown out of her house. And Elisha goes to this woman, and he, through a miracle of God, he shows this woman how to fix the problem. And I want to read through this account, and then I want to show you how there's a lesson for us in this that we can apply to ourselves today. And just remember this too. Jesus looks at sin in the framework of debts. He says, let us forgive those that are in debt to us and so on in the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about, so he's looking at sin in the standpoint of a debt. So if we think about it that way, I want to show you a lesson that we can get out of this. In 2 Kings chapter 4, in verse 1, we're going to see this story here. Listen to what it says. It says, now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophet Elisha, saying, thy servant, my husband, is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, what shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? And she said, thine handmaid hath not anything in the house save a pot of oil. Then he said, go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her, and upon her sons who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, there is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. So this is a beautiful account here where this poor woman, she can't pay the debt, and so they're about to come and take her sons, and Elisha comes to her and says, what do you want me to do for you? And through God's grace, he gives her this plan to go out and borrow vessels of her neighbors, pots, if you will. And at this time, oil was a product that was worth money, a lot of money. And so she said, I've only got one pot of oil. That's not going to pay the debt. He says, go borrow the pots from your neighbors, bring them in, and we'll close the door in. And he says, now I want you to start filling up the pots. Now, usually in natural occurrences, what happens when you take a pot of oil and empty it into another one? That pot is empty. But we see here in verse 6, it says the oil stayed. In other words, through a miraculous intervention here, she would take that one pot of oil and dump it into every one. When she put that oil down, every time she looked down, it's full. It was God showing this woman grace and mercy. And incidentally, that's a good lesson for us about our bank accounts and the way we see money. We don't need to be concerned with getting a bunch of money piled up in our bank account or running out. We just need to make sure that we do what God says. God will take care of us, and the money will stay. The oil will stay in our accounts. But I digress. The lesson here is that God, through God's grace, he provided for this woman. And she was able to pay the creditors. And look at this phrase it says in verse 7. It says, then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil, pay your debt. But not only that, he says, live thou and thy children off of the rest. So God's grace, through this miracle, through the oil, provided this woman to pay her debt and then some. She had some left over. Now, turn to Romans chapter 5. With that in mind, and also think about where Paul talks about in Ephesians 2 about the riches of God's grace. You know, if you're here tonight and you feel like you're not a rich person, let me tell you, you are. You're a rich person. If you're a child of God, you are a rich person. You may not have a lot of money piled up or a lot of material possessions piled up in gold and silver, but God says we have the riches of his grace. So you're rich in a way that far exceeds any kind of money or anything upon this earth. Now look what it says in Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 20. Paul says, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. And so we see there, I mean, if you just think about all the sins that have been committed from the time that sin entered the garden with Adam, and all down time, all through the stream of time with the flood, with Abraham, with Moses, the nation of Israel, down to Jesus' time, the apostles, and up to today, think about all the sins that have been committed. It boggles the mind, doesn't it? But the thing about it is, God's grace is enough for that and then some. It says where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So whatever, people often say, well, I don't want to darken the door of a church building. I don't want to go to church. You don't know what I've done. Are you really that bad? I mean, the people in Acts chapter 2, they were guilty of crucifying the Lord. But remission of sins was offered because God's grace is sufficient and then some. So just remember, no matter how bad you think you are or whatever it is you think you've done, God's grace is sufficient for that and then some. Of course, where grace much more abounds, that's where the abundant life comes in. God blesses you. He shows you things in your life that you're seeing that nobody else in this world have any idea what that's all about who are not Christians. And so we truly do see the blessings of Christianity as we think about the grace of God and how it's sufficient for all of our problems and then some. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian and you would like to live your life with this kind of grace in your life, to have your cup overflow with grace, you can do that by obeying the simple plan of salvation by repentance, confession, and baptism. If you're here and you're a Christian and you've strayed off of the narrow path and you want to be brought back into the fold, you can do that by repentance, confession, and prayer. Whatever your need is, we are here for you tonight. Please come as together we stand and sing.